The main character's name was Irene. A guy with hair as white as snow addressed her by name and leaned over. She called out to the guy and called him Your Majesty. She knew that servants were never supposed to show emotion. Guy turned to Irene. He wanted her to tell if she would mind. They both knew that servants were the property of the imperial family, and they had to remember that. An incredible imperial palace called Verona, with huge grounds and an impressive view a few years ago. Irene was addressed by name, and some woman asked if she had picked up her dress. The woman wanted to throw petals into the bathtub and decided to ask the protagonist which ones to throw. The woman said that the thread seemed strange to her. Irene had already taken the dress and asked the heroine to leave the box with the jewelry. The protagonist advised that the petals should be dried immediately because they would give off a strong, pungent odor. It occurred to the girl that the experience of having a bunch of brothers and sisters was very useful for the servants. The girl was called out and warned about the thread. Irene ran to sort it out. The heroine is plunged into memories. Her father died in the war, and her mother was seriously ill. Because of these events, she had to feed her entire family by herself. She remembers how hard it was for them to survive on the small village wages. After these events, Irene jumped at the chance to become a servant at the imperial court. The girl already has 2 months worked as a servant in this place. She was satisfied with the salary and life in the capital. The protagonist was not difficult to work because she served the princess. Lauren Veronica was the princess of the empire and turned to Irene to thank her and note how quickly she was handling everything. Irene was the princess's savior. Veronica had no idea what she would do without the girl. Irene didn't understand how to react to such compliments and replied that Her Majesty was flattering her. The main character wanted to take Veronica to the banquet, and the princess didn't mind at all. On this day, Lauren's second brother was returning. With this news, she dumbfounded her servant, for Irene had not seen him until now. The princess's brother was the second prince of the Lauren Empire. He was the captain of the Order of Knights. The young man had a high status, but there were rumors of his rough character. Erin hoped in her thoughts that the prince would not quarrel with his father because there was to be a banquet in honor of the emperor. The princess stepped and felt a sharp pain in her feet. Irene was nearby and was surprised by this. Lauren had a size 230 foot, but they had brought her a size 220 shoe, and the shoes were too small for her. The servants didn't know what to do as the banquet was about to start in 5 minutes. Irene asked if Mistress's foot hurt a lot. The feet were hurting so much that Mistress couldn't walk. The protagonist lowered her gaze, and it stopped at her shoes. Imperial servants wore low-heeled black shoes. Her mother had made these shoes for Irene to make up for what she had been through in her life because of her family. Mom was apologizing for not being able to help Irene get into Mark's academy, which was her dream. And that's when she gave these shoes to her daughter. She told her to take care of herself and not to worry about anything. Irene didn't want to spoil her mother's gift, so she didn't wear them a dozen times. The girls had the same foot size, and Irene suggested her mistress to wear her shoes. They were sure to fit the princess' feet. Lauren put those shoes on while they searched for the right shoes for her. Irene asked another maid, Lisa, to escort Lauren until she returned. The tired protagonist sat down on the bench. The maidservant was lucky that her shoes were not visible behind her mistress's dress and avoided any problems. The maid could finally exhale and relax. Irene had been walking around barefoot the whole time. They had taken a good beating. She knew if she wore the shoes her mom gave her, she would get them dirty. She didn't want to ruin her mom's gift. A young boy sat down on the bench next to the girl. They met eyes. Their eyes merged into one and formed a single entity. Irene didn't know who the young man was. The girl stared at the guy hard enough, and he asked what she wanted. It was most likely a nobleman. The guy was having a bad day, and all his thoughts were preoccupied with just that. The girl thought about leaving. She was intimidated by this guy, but she smelled the scent of a forget-me-not flower. She didn't realize if the scent was coming from him. The boy turned to the maid. Irene was wrapped up in the thought of how handsome he was. The young man noticed the girl's bare legs and concluded that she had some strange hobbies. The girl could not tell him the real reason for her uncovered legs, for servants must keep their mouths shut at all times, no matter who stood before them. Any word of Irene's could hurt her mistress. The man saw that the girl's legs were covered with bruises, and he asked her if she was hurt. The protagonist was uncomfortable with the guy staring at her. She didn't understand what he wanted from her. She wanted to leave, but realized that he would watch her walk around barefoot. Irene still didn't understand why he was staring at her so intently. The girl realized that she couldn't sit like this, and it was better to leave, even though she was ashamed. The main character screamed when the guy got up. He thought he scared her, but she just wanted him to leave. The man sat down in front of her and their eyes met again. He asked that she hold out her feet to see what was wrong with them. The guy showed concern towards Irene and began to wipe her white, soft feet. No one had ever taken care of a maid before. This was a first for her. The guy wrapped her feet hastily. It tickled her enough at this time. He advised her to be sure to treat her wounds. Irene wasn't used to this, but she thanked the Lord and watched him leave. And here is how events unfolded 3 years later. A young girl was looking for the chapter and looked into the room in an effort to find it. She made no mistake about the door, and the chapter was in the room. She, with a calm tone, allowed her to enter. The girl had incredible thoughts. To be a servant of the princess already an accomplishment, but to be promoted to head servant in the palace was simply unthinkable. The girl came to report that the crown prince's suit had arrived. The head was surprised at how quickly it had arrived, but her thoughts were interrupted by the maid's question about her next actions. Today, the prince had a meeting before the dinner party, and the suit had to be taken to his office. That's where he usually changed. They had to hurry while there was still time. Nice-looking guy named Ivan Veronka, but he was the crown prince. He thought the dinner party was gonna be a problem, but now he's got another meeting on his hands. Everyone thought Ivan was extremely trustworthy. The emperor trusted him. That's why he trusted him with this job. Ira knew the more robotic Ivan was, the more robotic she was as well. A lone tear streamed down the girl's face. A year ago, when she worked for the princess, things had been much simpler. The whole country was moving at the same pace, and she didn't want to fall behind. A guy in a blue suit entered the office and addressed the prince. He announced that His Majesty Theo would be arriving today. Theo was the second prince, the very captain of the Order of Knights. Ivan was surprised at this news. Events that unfolded in Verona 3 years ago. At that time, the Empire of Verona was under attack by barbarians, supported by the Silverini Empire. The stronghold of the war was a border fortress, and its soldiers had a hard time. And even the second prince himself, the head of the entire army, had to enter the battle. The duration of the war was 9 months. Even the aristocrats joined the battle. The empire was able to survive because of their combined efforts. But during the war, the second prince was seriously injured. He was immediately sent to the temple because of this. He had not been seen for 2 years, and he was happy about that fact. The rumors said that his wounds were very serious. Theo was just incredibly strong. Because of this factor, he became the captain of the Order of Knights. The maid came in and announced that everything was ready. Theo announced that the girl had done a great job and had gotten everything done quite quickly. It was not expected of her. Irene thanked him and left. The emperor was happy to see Evan. It was unexpected for him. Lauren suddenly saw Irene and was overjoyed. She rushed to her and thought that her brother was torturing Irene because the girl was very thin. Lauren wanted her to come back to her, but her brother objected. He didn't see the point in having the head of the servants return to his sister. The girl thanked him for the offer, but the man was paying her much more than Lauren. It was about Theo. They were all for getting together that day. Lauren wondered if her brother was well. The emperor said that Theo had been fine for 3 months. The princess asked why he hadn't come back. She was shocked. Theo had been practicing every single day with the knights to get back in shape. The man didn't understand Theo, even though he was his son. Lauren concluded that they would have that pile of muscle back again. Irene smelled a familiar scent and saw Theo. Theo called his sister mean for discussing her brother so brazenly. Lauren took umbrage. Why would she be mean? Theo only sneered in response. They said a friendly hello to Ivan and they shook hands. Lauren didn't even shake his hand. The emperor asked his son if he was really healthy. Theo answered with a clear yes, and it's all thanks to your support. Theo fell down and even joked that it was knightly etiquette. Irene looked at the guy. Bea realized it was him. The same guy who had suddenly spoken to her and helped her 3 years ago. It was then that the guy had given her a helping hand for free. Irene prayed for his life every day that they would meet again. The girl noticed a change in the guy. Before he had all black hair, and now he was post-blonde in front of her. But he was still the same face and the same figure, and even the same scent of forget-me-nots as 3 years ago. Irene still couldn't believe it was him. She wondered if it could be someone similar. The two girls discussed that the other prince had been sent to a magic healer to cure him. Irene now understood. Magic had a way of changing hair color. The puzzle in her head was now complete. She was sure it was him. A tired girl came to her room and lay down on the bed. She was already agitated even though the prince had just returned to the palace. Irene got up from the bed and went under the bed. She took out a golden box that contained black bandages with a blue pattern. The same bandages that the second prince had used to wrap her legs during their first meeting. Irene guessed that the guy was a nobleman, but she had no idea that he was the second prince of the empire. It was a beautiful sunny day outside the window. Everything was in bloom. Irene was summoned to her room by His Majesty Ivan. The girl arrived just in time. There was a costume for the empire's longevity ceremony on the couch, but it was too big on Ivan. Her and Theo's costumes were mixed up. Ivan asked the main character to go check it out. The girl's thin brush approached Mr. Theo's door. Irene knocked and stepped inside. The servant announced that she had come on an errand for Mr. Ivan, but there was no one in the study. She was glad of that fact. She saw the suit lying on the couch. It was the one she needed to check out. It was obvious to the naked eye that the suits were mixed up. Irene couldn't help but pick up His Majesty Theo's shirt. After all, he was the first one to take care of the girl. She swore to herself that her heart would never waver. Mr. Theo had been away from the palace for 2 whole years, and his wounds were truly terrible. The girl brought the shirt to her nose and inhaled the fragrance of the forget-me-nots. This excellent fragrance was entirely Theo's. The maid hoped that no one saw this, but from the side, Mr. Theo was watching her. He stood in the room and watched the whole time as Irene took the shirt and pressed it to her face. A shiver went down her body at the realization that he had seen everything. She apologized to the second prince and equated her act to a mortal sin. After saying that, she had to run, and she was out of Theo's sight. Irene quickly ran out of Mr. Theo's office and thought about how crazy she was. The girl didn't know what she was thinking when she did this act. She was sure that it surprised the Lord terribly. She would be very lucky if the second prince forgot about this situation. The girl calmed down and wanted to take the suit to Mr. Ivan, but she forgot to take it. She realized that the suit would not come to her on its own and went to get herself. She didn't need to run away from reality. She needed to endure everything. Irene knocked on Theo's door and he allowed her to enter. She explained to the second prince that she came from Mr. Ivan, and he was the one who sent her there because their costumes were mixed up. She didn't want to disturb Theo, so she just took the costume and wanted to leave. The protagonist turned around and saw the tall, masculine figure of Mr. Theo in front of her. The second prince inquired as to whether he had met before. The boy stared at the girl, and she returned the favor. Theo wondered what Irene was doing with his shirt and why she had taken it, so he asked her about it. Irene didn't understand how it could be explained. She was sure that the other prince thought she was some kind of pervert. Theo asked the girl's name in response to which she was surprised. He didn't understand her reaction. After all, he had just asked the name. Irene thought that the gentleman was finding out her name in order to downgrade or worse. It was all Irene's fault. The servants had only one purpose above all others. They were never allowed to cross their master. Theo had a thought. Maybe she wanted to hurt his brother. That's why she was wearing his shirt. The Lord saw the badge of 3 stars on Irene's chest. They said that she held a high position in the palace. There weren't more than a dozen like her in the empire. The protagonist thought that he wasn't knowledgeable on the subject. Irene did not answer the master's question, and he asked her name again. She timidly mouthed her name. She felt that something was wrong and had a bad feeling. Theo, wearing a black shirt and a blue vest, entered the office and said hello to Mr. Ivan and Irene. Irene thought it was strange that the guy came in so often. The second prince asked Irene to leave her and her brother alone. They needed to socialize. She obediently left the study and disappeared behind the door. Theo had a request for his brother. He wanted Ivan to give Irene to him. Mr. Theo liked the girl during the first week of their acquaintance. That's why he wanted Ivan to give her to him. Irene was hard to pry out of Mr. Ivan's affairs. I wonder why Theo needed her specifically since there were other high-ranking servants. Irene used to be Lauren's servant, then Ivan took her in and promoted her to head servant. The 3 of them needed her, and that was why the prince had told his brother. Ivan finally agreed to give the main character to Theo, but on the condition that he would not bring her to resignation. If he did not do it, the second prince would go to the emperor and tell him everything. Regardless of how Lauren behaved, everyone knew Theo was not strong. Even could have called a priest to perform the ceremony again, but Theo wouldn't listen to him, turning around and preferring to get out of sight. Even reflected on the fact that Theo was completely unlike himself. Following God's will, Theo was supposed to live to the age of 23 and it was irreversible. But it had been 10 years since little Theo and his father had been told that. 23 Theo was 3 years ago. And it was 3 years ago that the war with the Silverini began. At the time, everyone had reasoned that the second prince would die in the war, but all ended well. The prince remembered that he had to ask Irene to go over to Theo, and he realized that he had better keep an eye on them. Irene was not left with thoughts of Mr. Theo. She was willing to do anything to make the second prince forget her. Mr. Theo approached Irene from behind and leaned in close to her ear so that she could feel his hot breath. The girl didn't expect it and immediately bounced away from the guy. The second prince saw the fright in the girl's eyes and paralleled it with the fact that she had sinned somewhere. Irene asked what the conversation was about. Theo replied that she would soon understand. Theo remembered their last meeting and placed his hand on the glass next to the ready girl. He offered her something more, meaning himself, but the girl timidly refused. At that moment he brought his index finger to the girl's lips and ran it gently over them. The second prince directly offered Irene to spend the night with him and sleep with him. The girl covered her ears in response to this offer because she didn't want to hear it. But the prince didn't understand this reaction because the girl heard everything anyway. Irene didn't understand why the prince was saying this to her. The protagonist could not contain her emotions and accidentally yelled at His Majesty. There was a huge gulf between them, and no matter how much Irene didn't want it, she couldn't let it happen, because she was a servant and he was a lord, and the difference between their statuses couldn't be ignored. Because of this, the girl tried to bury her feelings for Theo. The main character wanted to remain a loyal servant of Mr. Ivanu in order not to interfere with Theo. But the second prince for some reason still paid attention to the girl. Irene was standing in front of Theo before she heard the next question. He wanted to ask why she was acting like that, since for some reason she was pressing his shirt against her face. The girl couldn't give an answer to that question, so she asked a counter-question. She wanted to know why Theo was treating her like that. The protagonist couldn't ignore the attention of the man she liked, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to say weird things to her and ask her to sleep with him. Irene liked her master, which is why he offered her such things. After all, that was the reason why people slept with each other. She asked the other prince what exactly he liked about her. He immediately pointed to the beautiful girl's face with his words. She was surprised to hear such an answer. This was not enough for the girl. But the guy thought the opposite. They didn't know each other at all and could only judge each other by their appearance. Irene had never really thought about it, but she realized that the guy was right. The two of them knew nothing about each other and were no different in that respect. Theo told the girl to think about it and tapped his finger on her forehead. The guy finished his conversation and said that he would leave the rest of Irene to think about, and then he was out of sight. The news reached the two servants of the palace that Mr. Theo's new personal servant would be the head of the servants, and they excitedly began to discuss it among themselves. Irene came to Mr. Ivan and began to beg him to stay on as his servant, even judged by his experience, and realized that there was nothing to be done about it, and he could not change his brother's decision. Theo was not particularly fastidious, so the head of the maid could not worry about it. But the main character was not worried about that at all. She was worried about the fact that Theo wanted to sleep with her. The girl with the short haircut said that Theo already had 2 servants, so Irene didn't have much work to do. The protagonist didn't understand why Theo needed her then. Since he already had 2 servants, these thoughts frightened her. But she still couldn't do anything about it, and she just had to do her job well. A girl was cleaning the office of the second prince. He approached her from behind and asked her in a whisper if she had thought about their previous conversation. The girl didn't expect to see him behind her back and bounced away. Irene had been mentally preparing for this question, but she wasn't prepared for it to happen so quickly. Theo wanted a clear answer to his question, so he pressured the girl even more. Irene liked the other prince, so she just couldn't refuse him and she had to avoid answering. It was hard for her to have feelings for such a person. Theo took her hand and pressed her body closer. The girl looked at the prince in bewilderment, and the boy looked at her like a small, defenseless kitten. Mr. Theo took the maid by the head and fell into her honey-sweet lips, feeling their taste. The girl pushed her lord away hard, and he grinned at her reaction. And then Irene realized that from the very beginning the second prince was just mocking her. Irene was aggressively filling out a stack of paperwork and thinking about how it was very hard to resist temptation, and wanted to say no the next time Mr. Theo offered her something. In her place, every person would be surprised if the object of their affection offered to sleep with her. That thought put the girl at ease. The protagonist found a document that was written in the ancient language Okmat. It was not the first time the girl saw this language. Previously, she had encountered it when she was preparing to enter the college. Ulmat had not been used for a long time. She put the papers in a brown folder with black fittings, for they were going to be burned. The girl's head was filled with only one thought. How would she get the attention of the second prince away from her? After all, at this rate, she thought her heart would stop. A girl with black hair ran up to the head servant. It was Thelma. They had worked together when Irene worked as Lauren's servant. It had been a long time since they had seen each other. The main character asked how the princess was doing, and at that moment she realized that Mistress Lauren would be able to help her. The princess was happy to see her former servant, as they hadn't seen each other for quite some time. At that moment, Irene had about 10 minutes to convince Lauren to take her back as a servant. The time was so short because Mr. Theo had left for a meeting 20 minutes ago and could return at any moment. Mrs. Lauren understood that the girl had come to her for a reason and wanted to talk about something. The princess was willing to listen to the girl. Lauren didn't know that Irene was now Theo's servant and started asking how she was serving at Mistress Evan's place because he had a lot of things to do. The princess' ignorance made things difficult for Irene, but she still started to tell her that she was now Mr. Theo's servant, and due to unforeseen circumstances, His Majesty had replaced one servant with Irene. Princess Lauren was furious at her brother's behavior. Her Majesty wanted to know why Theo wanted Irene, so she asked the girl herself. The girl pretended not to know or understand. She lied that she had a lot of problems and Lauren thought that Theo had caused those problems. Irene couldn't confirm or deny that, so she smiled gently at the place of the answer. The princess stormed out of her seat and went to Theo's office to talk to him. Irene tried her best to stop her, but it was all in vain. She didn't even want to hear anything. The protagonist did not want to arrange a quarrel between brother and sister, but there was no way to influence it. Lauren went into her brother's room and saw that he was not there alone, but with his assistant. Theo didn't expect to see the girls. Lauren slapped her hand on the table and said they needed to talk urgently. Irene stood next to her and wanted to fall through the ground. She realized what she had done. If she had known it would go this far, she wouldn't have started this conversation. Irene stood at Princess Lauren's side, although she should have been by her master Theo's side. The girl wanted to go to Theo's side, but Lauren blocked her way with her hand and started a dialogue with her brother. She wanted to know why Theo made Irene his servant, or rather she wanted to know why he was making life difficult for the poor girl. Theo didn't understand what he was talking about because he didn't burden the main character with work, and she didn't do anything super complicated, and Irene confirmed it. She was very ashamed and wanted to rewind time. Irene had made a terrible mistake that day, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was very embarrassed to stand in front of Mr. Theo. It was not a problem for Irene to be with Theo, and she told him so. She obviously didn't like his molestation, so she took that step. Theo didn't expect that he was so disgusted with Irene. He promised that he would not allow such behavior on his part again. The second prince felt guilty and apologized to the girl, after which she left. There was an obvious truth in the palace: servants who lost trust had no future. There always had to be trust in the relationship between master and servant, and the head of the servant had deliberately slandered the master in front of another person. If Theo had ignored her from the beginning, it would have been much better. Before, he had at least said hello to her, but now he pretended that they didn't know each other and ignored Irene's existence. It hurt the girl, but she knew it was all her fault. The girl distracted the headmaid from her thoughts with a question. His Majesty Theo needed to make a suit for Lauren's birthday party and needed to get measurements from him. Recently, there had been a ceremony for the Empire's longevity where Theo had been wearing an excellent suit, but the guy had said that the suit didn't fit him. Irene knocked on the large, heavy door of Mr. Theo's study and entered to take his measurements. His Majesty was sitting at his desk writing some document. The girl reported that she had been sent to him to take the measurements for his sister's birthday suit. The guy stood in front of her and took off his vest so the girl could take the correct measurements. The young people exchanged glances and Irene felt that she was still tormented by thoughts of Theo. The servant finished her work and took all the measurements for the lord's suit. Irene felt her heart beating fast. She thought it would jump out of her chest, and that at this rate His Majesty would realize everything. The girl was about to leave, but accidentally tripped and started to fall. At that moment she felt Mr. Theo's big and strong hand grabbed her waist, and he didn't let her fall to the floor. The guy told her to be careful. The girl quickly pulled away from the guy, thanked him and wanted to leave, but Theo wanted to talk to her about something. At that inopportune moment, Theo's assistant in a black suit came in and Irene disappeared in the doorway. Theo was left alone with the boy, and the latter in turn asked if it was the maid Theo had told him about. And yes, it was her. His Majesty's aide started to say something about Irene's face, but abruptly interrupted his monologue and changed his mind about telling Theo. The second prince noted that they were similar to his brother in this way, because they started to say something and then stopped abruptly. The guy in the black suit came to talk about the successful development of the Northlands. Marquis Isaac was actively helping them. The presence of the second prince was not necessary. If something happened, he would be informed about it at once. The gentleman's assistant picked up a mountain of documents from which a black envelope with a gold seal fell out. The letter was for Theo, but he still had not responded to it. The senders of the letter wanted to win His Majesty over to their side in any way they could to capitalize on his popularity. Theo opened the envelope, which contained a letter, but it was all written in a language the boys did not understand. Mr. Theo didn't understand why they were sending him so many letters if they were going to meet at the temple for the service anyway. Assistant Theo's father was a pastor, but alas his son was not, and they could not make out what the letter was about. The second prince did not understand the point of sending letters in a language that only those who wrote them could understand. It was a beautiful sunny day outside the palace window. Birds were singing and everything was in full bloom. The red-haired girl said hello to the head of the servants. The servants were busy preparing for dinner. They were interested in it. Everyone was busy at that moment, but everyone was coping, and Irene was involved in gathering the second prince for the celebration. The red-haired girl partly understood why everyone wanted to take Irene as a servant. It was time for her to go, so she said goodbye to Irene and left to help prepare for the princess' birthday party. The second prince had a splendid blue suit with gold cuffs, fittings, and fringe on the shoulders. Also, 2 of the Lord's Award medals hung on his chest. Irene needed to concentrate, for she was thinking silly things. There were 5 people in the prince's study. 3 were helping him dress and 1 was reading him a report. Luckily for Irene, they weren't alone in the room. Theo was already packed and instructed his assistant to read the report next time. And Irene was frustrated by the fact that the gentleman still wouldn't look her in the eye. They entered the hall where the ceremony was to take place. Theo's assistant asked him to behave himself at the event. Theo calmed him down and said that he would not organize anything, but he did not mean it. Basil was Mr. Theo's closest assistant. He was his closest subordinate. This was the man the master could trust completely. He advised Theo not to drink much and Irene realized that he was definitely a good man. His Majesty assured Basil that everything would be fine and asked him to back off. The second prince was tired and planned to greet everyone and leave. Theo didn't observe his sister anywhere and wanted to know where she was. Irene had been meaning to say for a long time. Lauren was near the entrance and that was where they went at that moment. The others were already like that too. Theo hadn't been to the palace in a long time and didn't remember how to go to some parts of it. Basil helped him with that. He was already waiting at the entrance and was reprimanded for being late. The princess saw Irene and joyfully approached her. Irene was mutually happy to see her and in turn wished her a happy birthday. Lauren was grateful to the girl for coming to her celebration. Her Majesty was immediately reminded of the time when the protagonist served her. Lauren wasn't expecting to see her brother and they almost started fighting, but it was already time to start. Lauren walked past her guests and Theo noted that she was proud to the point of nausea. The princess threw her brother a judgmental look and walked on. Things were going much better than Irene had imagined. She hoped that this was how things would go from here on out. The birthday girl offered her brother a drink in honor of the celebration. The guests were discussing the fact that something was coming up, and it was an undeniable fact. The princess concluded that it was not interesting to drink just like that, and suggested that if she won, her brother would give her Irene. The protagonist was shocked by this turn of events. Theo noted that Lauren seemed to really like Irene. The brother and sister began to argue about who would be better for Irene, and she didn't understand why they were betting, because whoever took her didn't have a choice. They started the bet and Theo had the first drink and said that if he won, Lauren would never bring it up again. The 2 of them agreed to the terms. Irene stood in anticipation and waited to see how it would end. There were bottles scattered around the table where they were drinking, and the man who was drinking next to them felt bad and left the event. Irene wanted to stop them, but Theo took the bottle of alcohol from the servant's hands and poured himself a drink. He was determined not to give Her Majesty the main character. Mistress Lauren felt sick and walked out from the table. Theo was drunk and Irene helped him to his room. The head servant thanked her staff and went to Mr. Theo. He was obviously not feeling well. The girl sat on the edge of the couch and began undressing the Lord, just to help him, especially since it was her duty. Next to him, Aaron's heart was beating very fast. It seemed to be not just sympathy but a strong crush. Aaron thought that he hated her after she betrayed him. The girl wanted to know the answer to the only question: why he wasn't talking to her. She asked it to the sleeping guy, hoping he would answer. Theo continued to wreak havoc in the girl's life. She would feel a lot better if he told her he hated her. She thought the prince had fallen asleep and could not resist the urge to kiss him. The girl timidly and gently covered Theo's lips with her own, and at that moment the boy opened his eyes. Irene opened her eyes and saw that the master was awake and looking at her. Theo picked her up and plopped her on the couch so that he was on top of her. He asked why she said she didn't like the kiss, why she didn't want to sleep with him, but kept it up. The girl never said she didn't want to. She couldn't agree to it because of the status difference. Irene constantly avoided eye contact with Theo. Ops asked her to stop doing so. There were to be no more misunderstandings between them. The master asked if the girl really wanted to sleep with him. Theo said he would kiss her as she didn't answer. She could have hit him or bit his tongue, but she answered him with a mutual kiss, and Irene realized that she really loved this guy. Irene was kissing the person she loved for the first time. He put his hand under her skirt, and she realized that she had never felt like this before. She couldn't breathe. It was all very strange to her, because he was drinking and she was intoxicated. But the guy was sober and his mind was clear. He wouldn't run from responsibility after this. Irene had always wanted to, but she couldn't tell Theo directly. The guy asked the protagonist not to worry and promised that he would be gentle. Theo asked Irene not to close herself off from him. The guy wanted to see all of her. Now they were getting serious. It was already morning outside the window and Irene woke up. She was confused as to how she could let this happen at night. He was her master. The girl did not spend the night in the dormitory. It could have been noticed and rumors would have started. Irene didn't want that and was about to get out of bed to leave, but the prince noticed and pulled her into his arms. Guy noted that Irene hadn't been drinking last night, and he was already aware of everything when he got under her skirt, so they didn't have any problems. Theo asked the servants to bring clothes for Irene. She didn't understand why he did it. After all, now everyone could find out about their relationship. The guy asked if the girl would have breakfast, or if they could do the same thing they did at night. The maid had a very sore lower back and refused Mr. Theo. Basil was already knocking at the prince's room and came in with breakfast as soon as Irene got dressed. Theo gave his food to Irene and listened to what his assistant came to report. Basil gave the second prince a letter from the temple, and the prince wasn't too happy about it. He realized he wouldn't be able to read its contents again. Irene had seen this letter before, but had scrapped it last time. It was necessary to read the letter and reply to it. Letters were sent all the time, and the girl concluded that only important information could be sent so many times. Aaron understood the language and could translate the letter for the prince. The events of 10 years ago began to come to mind. Theo was a 13-year-old child when he and his family learned the prophecy. In 10 years, the boy was to be overtaken by death, and it was not abhorrent. Irene wanted to help the boys with the translation of the letter. They were surprised that she knew this language even though she had not entered the spiritual academy. The girl amazed the young men with her knowledge of the ancient language. Although Theo was from the royal family of Verona, he had never been close to religion, but absolutely all the prophecies of the high priest came true. A priest 10 years ago told a prophecy that Theo would die at the age of 23, but he is now 26 and still alive. And judging by the translation, the path of his destiny has changed. Basil advised the second prince to go to the temple, as the initiation ceremony would be held in just 4 days. The Ide wanted to object and tell the prince to go earlier, but Theo had enough problems without this prophecy. 4 days would not solve anything. Irene was glad she had translated the letter and was able to help in some way, but she wondered why the prophecy had changed. When Irene returned to the dormitory, another maid named Evra asked why she didn't return yesterday. The protagonist tried to change the subject, but she failed. She started to explain to Evra that His Majesty Theo had been drinking too much last night, but her friend interrupted her and advised her to hide the kiss on her neck so the butler wouldn't find out. Now Irene had to be much more careful with Mr. Theo. Irene was pouring tea into a mug and Theo came up behind her and hugged her. The girl was a little startled by the surprise. The guy asked her what she was going to wear to the ceremony. She said the same as she always wore. The guy took the girl by the waist and wanted her to take a break. Irene was pleased with his attention. To take good care of Theo, Irene agreed to go to the ceremony. The boy asked how the maid's lower back was and if she needed a doctor. Her lower back was already fine at that point. Irene complimented the prince on his scent. He smelled very pleasantly of forget-me-nots. His eyes were as blue as that flower. Theo was glad that things were getting better for them. In the beginning, Theo thought Irene was very cautious. That's when he started to notice her gaze directed straight at him. He always wondered why she was looking at him like that. For a while, the prince could resist the green-eyed beauty's charms, but everything led to them becoming too close. It was both strange and cute at the same time. Second Prince Theo was the first person in the history of the Veronica Empire to change the prophecy of the temple. Such a thing was only possible through sheer force of will and great risk. Now the future of Mr. Theo could not be predicted, he could create it for himself. And it was quite possible that it would save many lives. In all the time she had worked at the palace, Irene had never traveled outside the palace. The only place she had traveled to was the Imperial Southern Citadel, though that was also part of the palace. The journey from the palace to the temple took about an hour. Irene felt the same as when she first arrived at the palace. Theo rode along with Belize in silence, and Basil broke it. He voiced his concerns about Irene to the prince. She seemed suspicious to the aide after all. She had not entered the academy, and she read so well in the ancient language. Even his father had a poor command of the language when he became a priest. The guy in the black jacket suspected that Irene might be a temple spy. If Irene really was a spy, that would explain why she was looking at His Majesty Theo like that. But Irene didn't look like a temple spy at all, and no matter how it was still Mr. Theo's girlfriend. Belize was always very cautious, so his suspicions were also understandable. The protagonist stepped out of the carriage, and before her stood a huge temple, with golden domes and high spires. The girl was in the grip of the Holy of Holies of any theologian. She marveled at the size of the temple, for she had seen it for the first time in her life. His Majesty's aide, Theo, planned to expose Irene, no matter what it cost him. The high priest was told that the imperial carriage had arrived, but alas, the emperor could not be present. The priest immediately concluded that this meant the process of handing over the throne. Ivan, the emperor's eldest son, was to be the successor, and Prince Theo fully supported his candidacy. The emperor could never deny his favorite daughter Lauren anything, so it was probably just a matter of getting his blessing. The priest had not seen the emperor's children for a long time. He'd been expecting them for a long time. They announced the beginning of the blessing ceremony. Irene had always wanted to dedicate herself to the faith, but as soon as she saw the ceremony, her heart fell into her heels. In order for a girl to become a high priest, she had to become an incredible person like him. The second prince was now in full health, and this was all due to the indispensable support of the church, for it sent letters to Mr. Theo, one of which he had just had time to read. Theo gave the order for the ceremony to begin. The priest wanted to tell a new prediction. Irene was happy to see this miracle with her own eyes. Theo asked Basil's opinion of the high priest. Theo thought that the true motives were not as bright as they seemed at first glance. Much less changing the prophecy could have dealt a huge blow to the authority of the church. The prince thought that was why the letters were sent in ancient languages, so that no one could know the truth. And before the ceremony, the high priest wanted to speak to the second prince alone. This seemed very suspicious to the boy, so he asked Basil's opinion about it. Theo huffed that the priest wanted to alter the prophecy in advance in order to use this knowledge for his own purposes. During the blessing, a pure white light illuminated the temple. It was a divine revelation. It was God who intervened in Theo's destiny and changed his fate. God had saved the boy's life. His Majesty was blessed as it was. The supreme fate had read prayers, but they had no effect, and he now realized why, and the white light that surrounded His Majesty was proof of that. God could not intervene in the fate of an ordinary man. Theo was the reincarnation of a god. He could change the whole world. It had been 1,000 years since such a miracle had taken place within the temple walls. It happened exactly during the reign of the high priest, and he did not want to miss such a chance. Half of the guy's arm was colored black. A guy in a white robe called Irene to him. The guy's name was Batin. The guy looked familiar to the girl, but she wasn't sure. As it turned out he was Basil's brother, they did look alike. Leighton put his hand on the girl's back, and a bright yellow color with a green edge lit up. It was a treatment, and it was complete. It was incredible, for Aaron's lower back no longer hurt. Theo got down on one knee in front of her and lowered his head. The girl didn't understand why Theo kept kneeling down in front of her. The fact that Prince Theo had been blessed by the Lord himself was unbelievable. It was the first time Aaron had seen such an act, and she herself had once actively studied theology. Theo really deserved this blessing. His Majesty invited Irene to come to his room at night. She wondered why, but didn't want the boy to say it out loud. In the courtyard of the palace, the servants were actively discussing the blessing of the second prince. The knights were saying that God always blesses Veronica's heroes. The second servant didn't believe it and thought it was just another political ploy. Irene believed in Theo. Irene didn't come at night as she had agreed with Theo because she had a night shift. If there were no night shifts, the girl would have enjoyed coming to the second prince. The Lord invited his servant to come to his house for the night. Irene thought that they had slept together on the spur of the moment and that His Majesty wanted to play with her. But with each passing day, she understood less and less of his train of thought. But after that night, she decided that she wouldn't worry about it anymore. After all, their difference in status was still an insurmountable barrier, and the girl still did not understand what kind of relationship she and the prince had. Because Irene was thinking about it, she accidentally overflowed the tea and broke the cup. Theo told her about it. She immediately started to clean it up and accidentally hurt her foot. But the prince took her by the tips of her slender fingers and stopped her. He took her in his arms and set her on the couch, but the spilled tea still needed to be cleaned up. So he called another servant to do the job. Theo leaned against her leg, just as he had on their first meeting. Irene apologized for her clumsiness. It seemed to her that she was only getting in Mr. Theo's way. She was the head of the servants, but she had made stupid mistakes. Theo objected because she cleaned, watched him, and helped with the paperwork. She was doing a good job in general. The protagonist was always helping His Highness and Basil with documents. The prince convinced the girl that without her everything would have grown dusty long ago. Mr. Theo would be late for every meeting if Irene didn't prepare his clothes, and thanks to this girl, Theo's life was much easier. He had chosen Irene to be his servant, and all the girl's mistakes were his own. All of his words made no sense to Irene after all. Servants were not supposed to make mistakes ever, and for no reason. This fact was known to everyone. But Theo kept saying these things anyway, kept caring and comforting Irene. He always said what she wanted to hear. Theo and Irene were in bed. The prince asked to be called by his name, but Your Majesty involuntarily popped from the girl's lips. The Lord wanted to spend the whole night with the servant in bed if she wouldn't call him by his name. It was night outside. Basil had relayed that they would have to arrive at the temple at dawn tomorrow. The girl standing next to him knew that this did not bode well for Captain Theo. Irene walked into Theo's office to drop off her paperwork and saw an unfamiliar brunette there. It was Monette. She was dressed in a black suit and had a high ponytail on her head. She began to tell Mr. Theo how the mission was going. The marauders had taken over the northern passage to the Camel Mountains. Negotiations were unsuccessful, so they had to deal with it differently. Several holy artifacts were stolen from there, but they should be returned to the palace soon. Monarch reported that she had been contacted by the church. Theo was marked with the mark of the apocalypse, and now for him, the church was looking for an avatar. The mark of the apocalypse was a rare phenomenon, and only those blessed by God were subject to it. An avatar is an intermediary between a blessed person and God, and anyone who spoke to the prince could become his personal avatar. And because of this search, the church contacted everyone the second prince knew. But no one knew what kind of avatar they had found for Theo. Theo didn't understand why he would be summoned to the temple for such a small thing, but it was a huge concern for the church. This event could change the course of history. The identity of the avatar the temple wanted to reveal on the second prince's birthday. This was all strange, and Theo had a bad feeling about it. If the church had already chosen an avatar, it meant that they were an extremely close person to Mr. Theo. The second prince didn't care about that after all. He had enough troubles as it was. He asked Monette to pass this on, and for the church to handle it themselves. Monette left to relay Mr. Theo's instructions. Irene wanted to leave as well, but Theo grabbed her by her dress and talked about how the girl needed a break, since she was already running around a lot. The servants still had work to do, but the second prince insisted that she rest and not overwork. The girl asked Theo about the avatar. Was he really not interested? If it were him, Irene would have died of curiosity. The prince replied that he already had a lot on his plate and asked the girl to talk to him while he filled out the paperwork. Irene underestimated the prince and thought she would only get in the way with her chatter. Thea wanted to talk about Irene, so she started a story about her family. There were 5 children in her family. Her mom was always busy, so the girl always took care of her siblings by herself. She had a lot of experience in household chores, and that's why she became a servant. Irene didn't have a father. He died when she was still young. He was drafted into the war and died on the battlefield. The girl's mother worked as a maid for an Oriental writer and learned from him that the imperial palace hired servants, and that's how Irene got into the palace. Before her daughter left, her mother made her homemade shoes, but Irene didn't have many occasions to wear them. The girl wrote to them constantly, and Thea wondered if they were all right. The girl's salary was enough to help. Now Theo understood why she was preparing to enter the academy, but never managed to study there. It was all because the girl was carrying the whole family on her shoulders. The guy was absolutely right that Irene would never betray him. Basil came to tell Mr. Theo about the avatar, but he was already aware. It had already been reported to him by Monet. The Eye had gathered all the information about Irene, but there was nothing suspicious there. The second prince thought so, but Basil was sure to always be on his guard. Theo asked that Belle check to make sure Irene wasn't a spy, but only so she wouldn't find out. The second prince wanted to introduce Irene at his birthday party. After all, he was sure that the person the temple wanted to send would not be reliable and would just want to gain the prince's trust. It was expected, because Theo had received the blessing of the god, and through the avatar the temple wanted to build a connection with him. The captain was very glad that Basil was on his side. Basil was unrequitedly in love with Monet, so he sent her many letters about Irene, although one would have sufficed. Theo told his assistant that rash behavior was bad, but he was the same way. Irene stood by the window in Theo's office and completed his birthday suit. When everything was perfect, Monet came up to her and asked for records of the undeveloped northern lands. The servant gave her what she asked for. The girl in the black suit told her what Basil had written about her in his letters. They had seen each other recently, but had not had time to get to know each other because Monet was so busy. She introduced herself to Irene as His Majesty Theo's assistant. The girls shook hands. Basil sometimes wrote to Monet, and in one of his letters he mentioned the maid's name. He did not tell her anything special, but the head of the maid was surprised that Basil mentioned her in his letters. The helper told his lover that Theo and Irene were in love with each other. Monet promised not to tell anyone and wished the young people happiness. Irene understood that it would be terrible if the rumors began to spread, because it could cause problems for both her and His Majesty. This thought was very disturbing to her. Monet walked down the hallway thinking about her new acquaintance. She was very nice, and Basil was blind not to notice it. The prince's assistant now understood why he was in love with Irene. It was the birthday of the second Prince Theo. His personal maid and the lady of his heart Irene helped him to get ready. The guy was very grateful to her for that. The couple had to go because the ceremony was about to begin. The emperor walked into the huge hall that was filled with people and thanked everyone present for coming to wish his son a happy birthday. The emperor made the announcement that his son had been blessed by the Lord, and then a girl with hair white as snow and copper eyes entered the hall. She was dressed in all white. It was the avatar of the second prince. She was honored to be present at this event. Theo was outraged that his avatar turned out to be a girl, and Irene realized that there was only more trouble to come. It was an honor for the girl to speak to the emperor himself. The girl's name was Sonia Dale. It seems she was the daughter of Jason Dale himself. His Highness wished Sonia a good time. Lauren was outraged that the avatar had the nerve to come dressed in white. It wasn't a wedding after all. Ivan came up behind Theo and wished his brother a happy birthday. The princess was upset with Ivan for not wishing her a happy birthday. The princess was offended at Ivan for not wishing her a happy birthday. Lauren joked that even Irene couldn't stand him. Her Majesty just didn't know about their relationship. Ivan had a lot to do, and after congratulating his brother he left. The prince was very attentive to Theo, but everyone present was only paying attention to Theo's avatar. People only cared about the girl. The birthday boy noted that it had been a long time since the palace had had such a colorful personality, not to mention the fact that there hadn't been an avatar in 1,000 years. Lauren thought it was all nonsense, since they hadn't come to see a new avatar. Theo came down from the balcony into the hall, and Sonia came to him at once to congratulate him and apologize for the fact that she didn't even have a chance to introduce herself. The second prince didn't need it, but the girl insisted on their acquaintance, because in the future they would see each other much more often. Theo asked Irene where the urgent documents she had spoken of were. They were in his study, and the prince went there immediately. The servant tried to stop him, but it was all in vain. The head servant noticed the avatar's gaze. She had had the same look in the past. Mr. Theo twisted the brooch off his suit, but it might have broken because of that, so he asked Irene to take it off. His Majesty was tired for the day. Theo was constantly being bothered and bored by everyone. He didn't understand why everyone needed him so much. He was part of the ruling family, and obviously he needed to keep his face in public. Irene asked for the other prince to raise his hand, but the place he did so he pulled her to him and sat her on his lap. The guy asked for a maid to wish him a happy birthday, and the best gift from the girl would be that she would stop overworking. After all, Mr. Theo had taken her in to spend more time together, and Irene worked even harder than he did. Theo asked if it was okay to kiss the girl. If Irene said no, he wouldn't do it. The prince was turned on by everything his lover did. This was the way the head of the servants wished his master a happy birthday. The girl was still thinking about the avatar, and there was obviously something wrong with it. Theo didn't really remember this beautiful girl, and he hadn't really looked into her appearance. Even the fact that she was his avatar he had learned from others. The girl had work for the next day and was about to leave the second prince, but he stopped her with his passionate kiss because he only wanted her. In the morning, the guy woke up early and watched how sweetly his object of admiration slept. At that moment, she was very calm and peaceful, and as soon as she opened her eyes, she would become very active. His assistant came into Theo's room and wanted to report something, but the second prince kicked him out. The two of them left the room, and Theo listened intently to what Basil wanted to tell him. Basil had no idea why he needed the second prince so early, but it was his job to bring him. Theo didn't like the news. After all, he wanted to get some rest that day. The boys didn't have much time left, and Theo went to get dressed. And while the prince went to do so, he instructed the assistant to prepare a change of clothes for Irene. Theo, along with Basil, arrived at the Emperor's palace, and they were met by a man. He was honored to be near His Majesty. The Emperor was waiting for the boys in his garden, and the two of them went to meet the Emperor. The second prince was curious about what his father planned to talk to him about. The young men went into a huge garden of unknown beauty, where the Emperor was looking out of the window and waiting patiently for them. He invited his son to the table. He had called him so early, for Theo's servants had reported to His Majesty that the lad was already awake at such a time and was going to practice. The boy took a mug of tea and started drinking it. He concluded that the tea Irene had made for him was much tastier. Father asked Theo if he'd enjoyed the banquet in his honor, but the second prince didn't notice anything unusual at the banquet. There were just more people, music and alcohol than usual. The Emperor wanted to talk to his son about the girl who was at the celebration and turned out to be an avatar. Now she was to be called a saint because she had been chosen by a god, and was also a rather modest and sweet girl. It was natural for Sonia Dale, because she was a reincarnation of God. The Emperor had been in communication with the men of the temple a few days before his conversation with his son, and they made a proposal to marry Mr. Theo and Sonia. The second prince was puzzled. This marriage was very important to the empire, for through it, the imperial family and the temple could make a centuries-old alliance. Theo put the mug of tea on the table and asked him to stop rambling. The Emperor pretended not to hear it. This wedding was necessary not only for a successful union, but also to show his gratitude for saving his life. It was an opportunity to show his gratitude. The Emperor asked his son to think about it, but he didn't need time to think about it. He clearly knew there would be no wedding. If the Emperor wanted to repay the saving of his son's life, he would have been better off lavishing gold rather than using Theo for a political marriage, pretending as if he meant something to his father. After that, Mr. Theo deflected. Basil didn't know whether it was worth it to refuse His Majesty so harshly, but the boy was unbending in his decision. He didn't run to do his father's bidding, for marriages should be for love, not profit. Out of anger, the boy hit the wall in front of him. Theo promised that he would never let this marriage happen. After all, if he and the saint were to marry, he could forget about Irene forever. A servant woke up in her master's bed and noticed that he was gone. She needs to tidy up her clothes, but first she needed something to wear, and she put on His Majesty's robe. And at the same second, a guy in a black suit walked into the second prince's room. He didn't know that the girl was in the room and Mr. Theo wasn't there. Irene managed to hide behind the bed before the guy saw her. It was Raoul, and she didn't understand what he was doing in Mr. Theo's room. If she caught his eye, there would be rumors about her. The head of the servants wanted the boy to leave quickly. Raul didn't understand why His Highness needed a maid's costume. The guy heard some noise under the bed where Irene was hiding. He thought it was rats. Raul was about to look under the bed when Mr. Theo came in the door and asked what the boy was doing. He answered that he had brought the maid's costume and put it on the table. Theo didn't need him anymore, so he went on with his business. As soon as the boy was out the door, Irene crawled out of her imaginary hiding place. She had a wound on her leg, as if she had hurt herself while hiding from an unexpected guest. Theo took her leg and told her to apply healing ointment to keep the wound from getting inflamed. Irene tried to convince her master that she was fine, but the bruise that appeared around the wound on her leg said otherwise. Aaron was very pleased with his master's concern. Twice already, the second prince had gotten worried and volunteered to help the girl. The maid was in good spirits. It seems her bruise really didn't hurt. Mr. Theo hoped that Aaron wouldn't hurt herself again in his absence. She should have taken care of herself even when the prince was around. The girl agreed with that. It was strange to Irene that at first His Majesty Theo seemed to her a rough and unpleasant man, but the more she got to know him, the more she became convinced that he was a very good and kind man. The girl asked where was Theo. After all, when she woke up, she didn't find him around. He told her that the emperor just wanted to see him. She really wanted to know what had happened, but it was unlikely that the second prince would discuss his affairs with a servant girl. When Irene thought about it, she began to worry about the difference in their statuses. Theo noticed that the girl was wearing his clothes. She justified it by saying that she needed to tidy up her clothes and grabbed the first thing that came to hand. On the table was the dress that she had brought in the morning. The head of the servants was feeling fine, and the prince told her that since it was so, he would go first, for it was time for him to go. He told her to get dressed and go out when she was ready. In the corridor, the girl saw Raoul. He was on his way to His Majesty's room to clean it, but Irene told him that she had just come from there, and it was such a mess that she had decided to clean it herself, and now the boy had less work to do. The boy had been there once, and also told him that there was a mouse in the prince's room, but he didn't know that the mouse was Irene. Thelma was talking about some news to Raoul. They were two more of those gossipy people, but Irene wasn't supposed to pay attention to it. It was none of her business, and she had work to do. An excited Thelma ran into Irene's study and told her the big news that all the servants were already discussing. The second Prince Theo was to marry Sonia Dale, who the girls wore on the prince's birthday, and that was why His Majesty Theo had a meeting with the high priest. Irene was shocked, and Thelma in turn said that it was true, for His Majesty was close to Sonia. That was why everything changed with her appearance, and they got along so well with the second prince, as if they were made for each other. The head maid was filling out paperwork and trying not to think about what she had learned, but the thought of how well they would look together kept her busy. It was hurting Irene. Because she was distracted, the ink stained the paper. A girl appeared behind Thelma and took her by the shoulder. It was Evra, and she had accidentally startled Thelma with her abrupt appearance. She told Thelma that the master wanted to see her and was waiting in the garden. Thelma thanked the servant for warning her and went to the appointed place. Evra turned to Irene. She needed to talk to her about something. Evra said that the rumors of Mr. Theo's marriage were probably true, and that she had told her to keep out of the way of the other servants. Irene thanked her friend for her concern, but there was no time for thanks at that point. Evra admitted to Aaron that if she were in her shoes, she would have cried by now, but Aaron was not allowed to show her true feelings. The maid advised the girl to stay away from His Highness Theo, because he was going to marry another woman and be with her. Sonia wasn't just a girl, she was a saint. And even if Irene had a special relationship with Theo, associating with him could only hurt the girl. Evra understood what the girl was going through, but she had to stop it and go her own way. She needed to keep her distance with Theo, and she promised to try to do that. Sonja seemed to like the prince, and if the two were really engaged, the only thing Irene could do was to wish the young one's happiness. Irene brought the documents that Mr. Theo asked for. He was leading the meeting and was almost finished. He said that the girl could wait for him. The head of the servants did not want to refuse, but lied that she still had one more thing to do. The second prince thought this was strange, for it was already night. The servant wished him a good rest and bowed out. A guy asked why she was working overtime. To this, the girl replied that she had a backlog of things to do. The guy asked her not to leave. He would take care of all her business. He took the girl by the shoulders, but she pushed him away and justified it by saying that she just wanted to leave. Theo inquired what was the matter with her that she was reacting like that, but the girl didn't answer him anything. The guy didn't interfere and let her go. In response, she wished him a good day. Monet and Basil stood behind the prince's back and discussed exactly what Irene had asked him to do. He told them to shut up and explained that there had been a lot going on lately, and she was just tired of all the worries, and that was why the second prince had let her go. The next day, Theo said hello to Irene, but she replied that she had a lot to do again today. 2 days later, Irene similarly found excuses not to see him. This time she was having a woman's day. A few more days passed and she was still running from the guy the same way. The girl was already tired of running and playing hide and seek with him. It was hard for her to even meet his gaze. Thea asked directly if the girl was angry with him. She answered in the negative, and the guy asked why she was acting so strange lately. Irene pretended not to understand what was going on, but the guy clearly wanted to know why she was avoiding him. After all, they were doing well. The servant had told him that she just wanted to reduce their communication to 0. Theo thought that some rumor had reached Irene, but she refuted this statement. He understood and let the girl go. Irene ended her relationship with her boyfriend. She got over it. All she had left were the bandages that the second prince used to wrap her legs with the first time they met. She held them in her hands at that moment as a memory of her time with him. Her eyes were wet, but she convinced herself that one should not cry because of some stupidity. She was not in a position to cry, but tears still rolled down her face and did not obey the girl. She believed that everything would definitely get better.